Julian and Revere heard the 13th strike. The soldiers on the wharf heard it too. 13, the British private asked, his voice trembling. That's bad luck, Jenkins. That's the devil's hour. Shut up, Jenkins snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. The clock is broken, just like everything else in this god-forsaken colony. But the rhythm was broken. The certainty was gone. On the deck of the Somerset, the watch officer hesitated. He was waiting for the signal rocket from Province House. Where is the flare? He muttered, peering into the fog. It's past the hour. Maybe the fog is too thick, sir. Maybe we missed it. We wait, the officer ordered. Do not light our flares until we see the general signal. We don't want to alert the rebels for nothing. Silence. The harbor remained dark. The midnight surprise had failed to launch. And in that darkness, under the cover of the confusion and the fog, a small rowboat pushed off from the marshy bank of the Charles River. Its oars were wrapped in sheepskin to muffle the sound. It slipped past the looming hull of the Somerset, invisible in the mist, carried by the outgoing tide. On the roof of Province House, the soldier finally got his tinderbox open. He struck the flint. Spark, spark. He got the match lit again. Better late than never, he grumbled. He touched the match to the fuse of the rocket. Hiss! The fuse burned fast. Get back, he shouted at Eleanor, though he didn't care if she burned. Eleanor curled into a ball, hurrying her head with the velvet cloak. Whoosh! The rocket screamed into the sky. It tore through the fog, a streak of red fire. It exploded high above the harbor, bathing the city in a crimson, eerie light. The soldier cheered. There! Let them hide now! Eleanor looked up. The red light reflected in her eyes. She stood up, slowly. The wind whipped her hair across her face. You are too late, she said softly. The soldier turned to her, the triumph fading from his face as he realized the delay. What did you say? I said you are too late. The tide has turned. He stepped toward her, his face twisting with rage. You are the clockmaker! The girl from the kitchen. He reached out to grab her. Eleanor didn't fight. She didn't run. She stood on the edge of the roof, the red light dying above her, plunging them back into darkness. You can arrest me, she said, her voice steady for the first time that night. But you cannot arrest the time. The door to the roof burst open. Soldier, report! It was Captain Hale. He emerged onto the roof, pistol drawn. He looked from the smoking rocket tripod to the soldier, and then to the woman standing by the chimney. Miss Sterling, Hale said. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded resigned. Captain. Eleanor nodded. The rocket was delayed, Hale observed. Almost 2 minutes past the hour. The match went out, sir, the soldier stammered. And the clock. The clock struck 13. It threw me off. Hale looked at Eleanor. 13 strikes. A mechanical failure or a ghost in the machine? Boston is full of ghosts tonight, Captain, Eleanor replied. Hale holstered his pistol. He walked over to the edge of the roof and looked out at the harbor. The red flare had faded. The darkness was absolute again. Did you see anything, soldier? Hale asked. When the flare was lit? Nothing, sir. Just fog and water. Hale sighed. He turned back to Eleanor. You bought them 2 minutes, Hale said quietly. I wonder if it was enough. He gestured to the open door. After you, Miss Sterling. The general will want to hear about this ghost story. Eleanor walked past him. She was a prisoner now. She knew that. But as she descended the ladder, she felt a strange lightness in her chest. She had heard the footsteps in the fog. She had heard the 13 strikes, and she knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that the boat had made it. The message was out. The war had begun, and she had fired the first shot. not with a musket, but with a gear. The cellar of Province House smelled of vintage claret and damp earth. It was a smell of wealth fermenting in the dark, a sharp contrast to the smell of soot and iron that defined Eleanor Sterling's life. She sat on an overturned brandy cask, her back pressed against the rough stone wall. The black velvet cloak she had stolen for her masquerade was wrapped tight around her, but it offered no warmth against the subterranean chill. The masquerade was over. The music from the ballroom above was now just a distant rhythmic thumping, like the heartbeat of a leviathan that had swallowed her whole. There was no window. The only light came from a single tallow candle, guttering in an iron sconce by the heavy oak door. The flame danced nervously in the draught, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched and retracted like grasping fingers. A flicker in the dark, Eleanor thought. That is all I am. She closed her eyes, trying to stop the trembling in her hands. She replayed the moment on the roof. The soldier's face, the dying match. The scream of the rocket tearing into the sky too late. Had it been enough? 2 minutes, she whispered to the empty room. I bought them 2 minutes. The heavy bolt on the door slid back with a screech of rusted metal. Eleanor stiffened, pulling the cloak tighter. The door swung open. Captain Hale entered first, carrying a fresh lantern. The light flooded the small cell, blinding her momentarily. Behind him, looming like a thunderhead in his scarlet coat, was General Haldimand. The general did not look like a dancer anymore. His wig was gone, revealing a scalp beaded with sweat. His face was flushed, not with wine, but with a cold, controlled fury. He held a riding crop in his hand, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh. Tap, tap, tap. So, Haldimand said. His voice was dangerously quiet. The clockmaker's daughter. The loyal subject. Eleanor stood up. It was an act of defiance she didn't feel, but she would not sit while they judged her. General, she said. Do not speak! Haldimand roared, the sudden noise making the candle flame jump. He stepped forward, invading her space. You have embarrassed me, girl. You have made a mockery of my command in my own house. He paced the small room, his shadow swinging wildly on the wall. 13 strikes, a delayed rocket, a soldier claiming you assaulted him on the roof, and, all the while, you were eating my food in my kitchen. He stopped, turning to face her. Who put you up to this? Who told you about the signal? No one, Eleanor lied. Her voice was thin but steady. I heard the servants talking. I went to the roof to see the view. The soldier startled me. It was an accident. An accident? Haldimand laughed, a harsh, barking sound. You tackled a grenadier of the King's army by accident. You sabotaged the Old North clock by accident. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. She could smell the brandy on his breath. We checked the tower, Miss Sterling. Mr. Finch found the bent rack hook. He found the tool marks. You bent the steel with heat. That takes preparation. That takes intent. That is not an accident. That is treason. Eleanor said nothing. There was nothing to say. The evidence was iron and brass. Haldimand struck the wall with his riding crop. A crack that sounded like a pistol shot. Where is the boat going? The one that slipped past while my men were staring at a dark sky. Who was on it? Revere? Adams? I don't know any boat, Eleanor said. I only know clocks. Liar. Haldimand raised the crop. General. Captain Hale's voice cut through the tension. He hadn't moved from the door. He stood calmly, holding the lantern, watching the scene with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen. General, Hale repeated softly. Striking her will not bring the boat back, and it will not make her speak. She is stubborn, like the metal she works. Haldimand lowered his arm slowly. He glared at Eleanor, his chest heaving. She is a spy, Hale. She should hang. Perhaps, Hale said. But a dead spy tells no tales. and we have a long night ahead. Hale walked forward, placing the lantern on a wine barrel. He looked at Eleanor. His blue eyes were not angry. They were disappointed. "You played me, Eleanor," Hale said. "In your kitchen. You let me believe you were a frightened girl protecting her father, but you were the threat all along." "I protected my home, Captain," Eleanor said, "just as you protect yours." "My home is the Empire," Hale corrected, "and you have struck a blow against it tonight. Do you realize what you have done? You haven't just delayed a signal. You have started a war." He pulled a chair from the corner and sat down, crossing his legs. He looked almost casual, as if they were back in the ballroom. "The boat that escaped," Hale mused. "It carried couriers, didn't it? Warning the countryside, stirring up the farmers. By tomorrow, because of your 2 minutes, we will have 1,000 angry militiamen descending on Boston." He leaned forward, his face illuminated by the flicker of the lantern. "And what happens then? Blood, fire, starvation. Your father's shop will be looted. Your neighbors will die. And it will be on your head." Eleanor felt a crack in her armor. The physical threat she could withstand. But this, the moral weight, was heavy. "They have a right to know," she whispered. "If you plan to close the port, if you plan to starve us." "We plan to restore order," Haldimand snapped. "Order that you and your friends have destroyed." The general turned to Hale. "I am going to the barracks. I need to mobilize the 4th Regiment. If the couriers are out, we must secure the powder house in Cambridge before dawn." He pointed the crop at Eleanor. "Keep her here, Hale. If she speaks, write it down. If she doesn't, let the rats have her." Haldimand stormed out, the heavy door slamming behind him but not bolting. Eleanor was left alone with Hale. The silence stretched. The candle in the sconce had burned low, the wax pooling on the iron. The flame flickered violently, threatening to go out. "He will hang you," Hale said conversationally. "Haldimand is not a forgiving man. He will make an example of you." "The clockmaker's treason. It has a ring to it." "Then I will hang," Eleanor said. She wrapped her hands around her elbows to stop the shivering. "Why?" Hale asked. He seemed genuinely baffled. "Why throw your life away? You are not a soldier. You are not a politician. You are a craftsman. You understand precision. Revolution is chaos. It is messy. It breaks things that cannot be fixed. Some things need to be broken," Eleanor said. "If the machine is crushing the operator, Captain, you do not oil it. You break the gears." Hale stared at her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver flask. He took a sip, then offered it to her. Eleanor hesitated, then shook her head. "Suit yourself." Hale shrugged. "It's going to be a cold night." He stood up and walked to the wall, examining the stonework. "You know, Eleanor, I checked the register of the Old North Church. Your father's name is on the maintenance contract. But he wasn't there today. You were." He turned to her. "But you weren't alone. The sentry at the bridge reported a man. Following you. A man in a brown coat." Eleanor's breath hitched. "Julian." "Julian Thorne," Hale said, testing the name. "We raided his mother's house an hour ago." Eleanor stood up, the chair scraping loudly on the stone floor. "You leave her alone!" "She is an old woman. She is fine," Hale said calmly. "Distressed, but fine. But Julian was not there. His bed has not been slept in." Hale moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Where is he, Eleanor? Is he on the boat, or is he hiding in your shop? Is he with your father?" "He is gone," Eleanor said. "Far away." "Is he?" Hale smiled, a tight, predatory smile. "You see, that is the problem with chaos. It is unpredictable." He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. It was crumpled. Wet. "We found this near the wharf," Hale said. "Dropped in the mud. It's a list of tide charts. Handwriting looks familiar, like the note you forged for the church." He held it up to the candle. "If he is on the water tonight, in this fog, without a pilot. He is dead, Eleanor. The Somerset has shifted her position. The channel is blocked." Eleanor felt the room spin. The Somerset had moved? "If he is on the water," Hale continued mercilessly, "he is sailing straight into the guns. Unless what? Unless we fire a second signal," Hale said. "A warning shot, to let the Somerset know there is a friend in the water, or a prisoner to be taken alive." He leaned in close. "Tell me the route. Tell me where they are landing. And I will order the Somerset to hold fire. I will take him prisoner, yes. But he will live. It was a bargain. A life for the cause." Eleanor looked at the flickering candle. It was dying. The wick was drowning in the wax. If she told him Julian would live in a cell, the message would stop. The countryside would sleep while the British seized the powder. If she stayed silent, Julian might die in the cold black water. "I don't know the route," Eleanor said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I truly don't. They didn't tell me." Hale studied her face. He was looking for the lie. He was looking for the tell he had seen in the kitchen. But this time she was telling the truth. Julian hadn't told her the landing point. To protect her. Hale sighed. He blew out the breath he had been holding. "Then God help him," Hale said. He turned to the lantern he had brought. He picked it up. "I have to go to the shop, Eleanor," he said softly. Eleanor froze. "Why?" "Your father," Hale said. "General Haldimand has ordered a search. A full search. Floors up, walls down. If there is so much as a pamphlet of sedition in that house, Arthur Sterling will be arrested as an accomplice." "He knows nothing!" Eleanor screamed, lunging at him. "He is innocent! He is loyal to you!" Hale caught her wrists easily. He held her there, her struggle useless against his soldier strength. "Loyalty is measured by results, Eleanor. And tonight the result of the Sterling family is treason." He pushed her back gently. "I will try to be gentle with the clocks." He walked to the door. "Hale!" Eleanor cried out. "Please, take me. Leave him be." Hale paused at the threshold. He looked back, his face half in shadow, half in light. "The candle is burning out, Eleanor," he said. "Pray for the dawn." He stepped out. The heavy door slammed shut. The bolt slid home. Eleanor was alone in the dark. The tallow candle in the sconce gave one last desperate pop and died. Total blackness. The Charles River. The darkness on the river was different. It was wet, heavy, and alive. Julian Thorne sat in the bow of the small wherry, his eyes straining against the gloom. The fog was lifting in patches, revealing glimpses of the black water that looked like oil. Paul Revere was at the oars. He rowed with a steady, silent rhythm. The sheepskin wrappings muffled the creak of the wood, but the sound of their own breathing seemed deafeningly loud. "We are drifting," Julian whispered. "The current is stronger than I thought." "Keep your voice down," Revere hissed. "Sound carries on the water." They were past the wharf. They were past the main anchorage. But the danger wasn't over. Somewhere ahead, looming in the channel, was the Somerset, the 68-gun man-of-war that guarded the exit to the bay. "We missed the signal," Julian murmured. "The flare. It was red. That meant interception." "But it was late," Revere grunted, pulling hard on the left oar. 2 minutes late, that delay. It meant they hesitated. It gave us the gap. "Eleanor," Julian said. The name felt heavy on his tongue. She did it. She's a brave lass, Revere agreed. And if we get caught now, her work is for nothing. Suddenly, Revere stopped rowing. He held the oars still, letting the blades hover inches above the water. Listen, Revere commanded. Julian listened. Splash, splash, rhythmic, heavy. Longboat, Revere whispered. Patrol. It was coming from the east, cutting across their bow. They are searching the channel, Julian said, panic rising in his chest. Haldimand must have guessed the route. Get down, Revere ordered. Flat in the boat. Julian curled up in the bottom of the damp wood, pressing his face against the wet planks. Revere did the same, shipping the oars silently. The wherry drifted. It was a piece of driftwood now, at the mercy of the tide. The sound of the patrol boat grew louder. They could hear voices, saw a shadow near the reeds. Fog playing tricks. Keep the lantern high. A beam of yellow light swept across the water. It cut through the mist, searching. Julian held his breath. He clutched the pistol in his belt. It was wet. It probably wouldn't fire. The light swept closer. It illuminated the water 10 feet from their boat. Julian could see the ripples. If the light touched them, it was over. He closed his eyes. He thought of Eleanor in the tower. He thought of the list in the clock. He thought of the promise of liberty. Please, he prayed, just a little more darkness. The light held steady for a moment. Then the sound of a bell rang out across the water. A ship's bell. Clang, 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 clang. The watch on the Somerset. The tide is turning, Lieutenant, a voice shouted from the patrol boat. We're drifting too close to the shoals. Come about, the officer ordered. Back to the ship. The light swung away. The rowing resumed, moving away from them. Julian let out a sob of relief. Revere sat up slowly. That was close. Too close. He grabbed the oars. The tide has turned, lad. It's helping us now. It's pushing us toward Charlestown. We made it? Julian asked, barely daring to hope. Not yet, Revere said, his eyes fixed on the distant shore where a faint light, a lantern in a friend's window, was flickering. But we have a chance. He looked at Julian. Row, boy, row, like the devil is chasing you. Because he is. Province House cellar. In the pitch black of the cell, Eleanor was not praying. She was thinking. Hale had said he was going to the shop. He was going to tear it apart. She knew the layout of the shop better than anyone. She knew where the loose floorboards were. She knew where the hollow weights were. But Hale was smart. He had watched her, but there was one thing Hale didn't know. Eleanor crawled across the stone floor until her hands found the rough wood of the wine barrels. She felt around the back. Rats, he had said. Let the rats have her. Province House was old. It was built on the foundations of an older merchant estate. And merchant estates in Boston often had drainage tunnels. Smugglers' tunnels. She felt the damp draft coming from the corner behind the barrels. She pushed the empty cask. It was heavy, but adrenaline gave her strength. She gritted her teeth and shoved. Scrape. Behind the barrel, the stone wall was crumbling. There was a grate, iron, rusted. Eleanor ran her fingers over the bars. They were thick, but the mortar holding them was wet and chalky. She grabbed a loose stone from the floor, a piece of the flagging. She began to chip away at the mortar. Clink, clink, clink. It was quiet work, slow work. Hale thought she was trapped in the dark. He thought the flicker of hope was gone. But Eleanor Sterling had spent her life working with brass and steel in the dim light of dawn. She knew that darkness wasn't empty. Darkness was cover. She struck the iron bar again. It wiggled. I am coming, Papa, she whispered into the black. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the scratching continued. A different kind of clock was ticking now. A race between a soldier destroying a home and a daughter trying to save it. And in the distance, on the Charles River, a boat scraped against the mud of the Charlestown shore. The flicker had become a flame. The mud of the Charlestown shore was not like the mud of Boston. It was deeper, colder, and smelled of ancient decay. The small, wary ground onto the bank. The wooden hull, groaning as it hit the mixture of clay and oyster shells. Paul Revere didn't wait for the boat to stop completely. He vaulted over the gunwale, his boots sinking calf-deep into the sludge. "Quiet," Revere hissed, though the wind whipping off the Charles River was loud enough to mask an army. Julian Thorne followed him, shivering violently. The spray from the river had soaked through his coat, freezing his shirt to his skin. His hands were numb. His fingers curled into permanent claws around the gunwale he had gripped for the last hour. They dragged the boat up into the tall reeds, hiding it from the prying eyes of the Somerset, which loomed like a black mountain in the channel behind them. "We are late," Revere muttered, checking his pocket watch by shielding it inside his coat. "The tide fought us every inch of the way. It's nearly 1 o'clock. But we are here," Julian said, his teeth chattering. "And we are alive." They scrambled up the bank, slipping on the wet grass. Waiting in the shadows of a cooperative shed were 3 men, Colonel Conant and 2 others. They held the reins of a horse, a small but powerful mare, her coat dark as the night, her breath pluming in the cold air. "Deacon Larkin's horse," Conant whispered as they approached. "She's fresh, and she's fast." "Did you see the signals?" Revere asked, taking the reins. "We saw the rocket," Conant said grimly. "Red, and then the darkness. We feared you were taken." "We had help," Revere said, glancing at Julian. "A guardian angel in the governor's house delayed the fire." Revere checked the saddle girth. He patted the mare's neck. The animal tossed her head, sensing the tension. "The regulars are moving," Revere told the men. "They are crossing to Cambridge. They're after the powder, and they're after Hancock and Adams in Lexington." "Then you must ride," Conant said. "The road is watched." A patrol was seen near Charlestown Neck. Revere mounted. He sat high in the saddle, a silhouette against the gray clouds. He looked down at Julian. "This is where we part ways, lad," Revere said. Julian looked up. "I should come with you. I can fight." "I don't need fighters tonight," Revere said. "I need voices. I need to wake the countryside. 1 rider is a messenger. 2 is a target." He leaned down. "Go to the safe house in Medford if you can. Or stay here and help Conant secure the shore." "Aye." Julian hesitated. He looked back across the river. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the distant twinkling lights of Boston. Somewhere in that maze of brick and tyranny was Eleanor. "I cannot stay, Paul. I have to go back." Revere frowned. "Back? Into the fire? You are a wanted man, Julian. Hale knows your name." "Eleanor is trapped in Province House," Julian said, his voice breaking. "Or worse, she bought us the time, Paul. She saved the mission." "I cannot leave her to Heldeman's mercy." Revere looked at the boy. He saw the resolve in his eyes. A different kind of patriotism. One born of love rather than duty. "The tide is coming in, Julian," Revere warned. "The current will be against you. And the Somerset is alert. Now." "Then I will swim if I have to," Julian said. Revere nodded slowly. He reached out and gripped Julian's shoulder. Then Godspeed, Julian Thorne. If we both live through this night, I will buy you the finest ale at the Green Dragon. And I will drink it, Julian promised. Revere turned the mare. He dug his spurs into her flanks. The horse surged forward. Thud, thud, thud. The sound of hooves on the frozen earth was rhythmic, powerful and terrifyingly loud. Julian watched him go. He watched the spark of iron shoes striking stone as Revere galloped into the darkness, riding toward Lexington, toward history, toward a dawn that would change the world. Julian stood alone in the mud. He turned back to the river. The water was black, swirling and rising. The midnight tide was at its peak. "Hold on, Elle," he whispered to the wind. "I am coming." The tunnels beneath Province House. The rats were not afraid of Eleanor. They chattered in the darkness, their claws scratching against the wet stone, annoyed by her intrusion into their domain. Eleanor didn't care about the rats. She cared about the water. When she had first broken through the grate behind the wine barrels, the tunnel had been damp but passable. It was an old storm drain built when the house was first constructed a century ago, designed to carry rainwater down to the harbor. But she had forgotten the one thing that ruled Boston: the sea. The tide was coming in. As she crawled on her hands and knees, the tunnel sloping downward, the water began to rise. At first it was a trickle over her fingers, then it was up to her wrists. Now, it was soaking the hem of her dress, heavy and freezing, dragging her down like a lead weight. The tunnel was narrow, a throat of rough-hewn granite barely 3 feet wide. The air was foul, thick with the smell of sewage and salt. Eleanor's hands were raw. She had lost the velvet cloak miles back, or what felt like miles. Her dress was torn. Her hair hung in wet, matted strings across her face, crawling. Just keep crawling. Every inch was a battle. Her knees struck sharp rocks. Her shoulders scraped against the low ceiling. Hale is at the shop. The thought was a drumbeat in her mind. Hale is at the shop. Papa is alone. She couldn't stop. If she stopped, the cold would take her, or the water would rise enough to trap her against the ceiling, filling her lungs with the filth of the city. The water was up to her elbows now. It swirled around her waist. She heard a sound ahead. A rushing noise. Not the trickle of a drain, but the surge of the ocean. The outlet. She pushed forward, gasping for air in the confined space. Suddenly, the floor beneath her vanished. She slid. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the stone. She plunged downward, sliding on a slick chute of slime-covered brick. She hit deep water with a shocking, bone-crushing impact. Cold. Absolute, paralyzing cold. She thrashed, kicking her legs. Her heavy wool skirts tangled around her ankles, pulling her down. She clawed at the water, fighting the panic that tried to seize her throat. Up. Swim up. She broke the surface, gasping, spitting out brine. She was outside. She was in the harbor. The drain exited under the wooden pilings of a wharf. Above her, through the cracks in the rotting planks, she could see slivers of moonlight. She grabbed a barnacle-encrusted piling. The pain in her hands was sharp, grounding her. She was alive. She dragged herself through the water, fighting the incoming tide that tried to smash her against the sea wall. She found an iron ladder bolted to the side of the wharf, a smuggler's ladder. She climbed, her muscles screamed, her wet dress weighed 50 pounds. She hauled herself over the edge of the wharf and collapsed onto the wood. She lay there for a moment, heaving, vomiting up seawater. She was shivering so violently, her teeth ached. She was covered in mud, blood, and slime. She looked like a creature birthed from the nightmare of the ocean, but she was free. She looked up. The sky was still dark. No dawn yet. She scrambled to her feet. She didn't know what time it was. The church bells were silent now. Not now. She began to run. She ran barefoot, her boots lost in the slide. She ran through the alleys of the North End, keeping to the shadows. She was a ghost, a specter, haunting her own city. She had to beat Hale. She had to get to King Street. Sterling and Cohen Horology. The bell above the shop door did not tinkle politely. It crashed to the floor as the door was kicked in. Arthur Sterling woke with a start in his armchair. He had fallen asleep by the dying stove, waiting for Eleanor. The blanket slipped from his lap. "Eleanor?" he wheezed, squinting into the gloom. Lantern light flooded the shop. Harsh, swinging beams that cut through the dust. Men poured in. Soldiers, redcoats. "Secure the exits. Check the cellar. Check the loft." Arthur tried to stand, his heart fluttering like a trapped bird. "What? What is the meaning of this?" "I am a citizen. I have a license." A figure stepped through the broken door. He was tall, composed, and carried himself with a weary lethargy. Captain Hale. He looked around the shop. He looked at the rows of ticking clocks, the glass display cases, the orderly workbench. "A license is a privilege, Mr. Sterling," Hale said quietly. "Not a right." He walked over to Arthur. He didn't shout. He didn't strike the old man. He simply looked at him with pity. "Where is she?" Arthur stammered. "My daughter?" She went to Province House, with the General's watch." "She is a guest of the General," Hale said. "For now," he signaled to his men. "Search it, all of it." "Search what?" Arthur cried, clutching his chest. "We have nothing. We are loyal." "We are looking for paper, Mr. Sterling," Hale said. "We are looking for lists, maps, letters." The soldiers began their work. They were efficient. They were brutal. A corporal swept the contents of the workbench onto the floor. Crash! Tiny brass gears, springs, and jewels scattered like confetti. Another soldier used the butt of his musket to smash the glass of the display cabinet. He reached in and pulled out the silver pocket watches, tossing them into a sack. "Stop!" Arthur screamed, lunging forward. "Those are customers' property. That is a Harrison chronometer. You will ruin the escapement." A soldier shoved him back. Arthur fell into his chair, gasping for breath. "Please," Arthur begged, tears streaming down his face. "This is my life's work, Eleanor. Eleanor is a good girl. She fixes the General's clocks." "Your daughter," Hale said, picking up a delicate carriage clock and examining it, "is a saboteur, Mr. Sterling. She delayed a military signal tonight. She aided the escape of traitors." Arthur stared at him, his mouth opening and closing. "No, not Eleanor. She is afraid of the dark. She hates politics." "She is very good at hiding in the dark," Hale said. He dropped the clock. It hit the floorboards with a sickening crunch. "Tear down the paneling," Hale ordered. "Check behind the wainscoting." The soldiers took crowbars to the walls. The sound of splintering wood filled the shop. The ticking of the clocks was drowned out by the destruction of their home. Arthur Sterling watched. He watched his sanctuary being disemboweled. "The grandfather clock!" a soldier called out from the hallway. "The big one! It's locked!" "Break it!" Hale said. "No!" Arthur shrieked. He found strength he didn't know he had. He scrambled up and ran toward the hallway. "Not the grandfather. It was her mother's. It hasn't run in 10 years. He threw himself in front of the massive mahogany clock, spreading his arms to protect it. "Move aside, old man," the soldier growled, raising his musket butt. "Wait!" Hale stepped forward. He looked at the clock. He looked at Arthur's terrified face. "Why this one?" Hale asked softly. "Why is this one so precious, Arthur? Is it the memory, or is it what's inside?" "It is empty!" Arthur sobbed. "Eleanor keeps it empty!" Hale's eyes narrowed. "Eleanor keeps it empty." "Open it!" Hale commanded Arthur. Arthur's hand shook so badly he couldn't get the key from his pocket. "Step aside," Hale said. He drew his pistol. He didn't shoot Arthur. He shot the lock. Bang! The sound was deafening in the confined hall. The wood shattered. The door of the clock case swung open. It was empty, just the heavy weights and the motionless pendulum. No papers, no muskets. Hale peered inside. He ran his hand along the bottom. Dust. He looked back at Arthur. The old man was slumped against the wall, clutching his chest, his face turning a terrifying shade of gray. "It's empty," Hale announced. "A false alarm." But the damage was done. Arthur Sterling slid down the wall. His breathing was a jagged, wet rattle. "Papa!" The scream came from the front door. Eleanor stood there. She was unrecognizable, a creature of mud and water, wild-eyed and bleeding. She saw the smashed cabinets. She saw the soldiers. She saw her father on the floor. "Papa!" She ran to him. The soldiers made to stop her, but Hale held up a hand. "Let her pass." Eleanor fell to her knees beside her father. She grabbed his hands. They were cold. "Eleanor," Arthur whispered. His eyes were unfocused. "The gears, they are all bent." "I am here, Papa. I am here." She wiped the hair from his forehead, leaving streaks of mud on his pale skin. "You fixed the clock?" he asked, his voice barely a breath. Eleanor looked at him. She looked at Hale, who was watching them with a stony expression. "Yes, Papa," she lied, sobbing. "I fixed it. It is running perfectly." The general was pleased. Arthur smiled, a faint, weak smile of relief. "Good. Good girl. Reliable." He took one last shuddering breath, and then the mainspring of Arthur Sterling's heart simply snapped. He went still. Eleanor froze. She held his hand. She waited for the next breath. It didn't come. The shop was suddenly silent. The soldiers stopped their smashing. Even the surviving clocks seemed to hold their breath. Eleanor slowly lowered her father's hand. She stood up. She turned to face Captain Hale. She was dripping wet. She was shivering, but her eyes were dry now. The tears had stopped. In their place was something else. Something harder than brass. Something tempered in the fire of the last 24 hours. "Are you satisfied, Captain?" she asked. Her voice was low, devoid of fear. Hale looked at the dead man. He looked at the destruction his men had wrought. He looked at the girl he had underestimated. He holstered his pistol. "It was an unfortunate necessity," Hale said. He sounded tired. "If he had just stepped aside." "He stepped aside his whole life," Eleanor said. "He stepped aside for your taxes. He stepped aside for your patrols. He stepped aside for your governor. And you killed him for it." She took a step toward him. The soldiers raised their muskets, but she ignored them. "You were looking for treason, Captain. You were looking for the rebellion?" She pointed to her own chest. "It is not in the clock. It is not in the papers. It is here, and you just lit the fuse." Hale stared at her. He saw the change. The clockmaker was gone. "Arrest her," Hale ordered quietly. Two soldiers moved forward and grabbed Eleanor's arms. She didn't fight. She didn't flinch. "Take her to the jail," Hale said. "General Haldimand will decide her fate in the morning." As they dragged her out of the ruined shop, Eleanor looked back one last time. Not at her father's body. She would mourn him later, when the war was won. But at the open door, the grandfather clock. It was empty, because she had moved the list. But Hale didn't know where she had moved it. As she was shoved out into the cold street, the first gray light of dawn was touching the chimney pots of Boston. The midnight tide had receded, but a new tide was rising, a red tide, and somewhere in the distance, far beyond the city, The sound of a single musket shot echoed from Lexington Green. The shot heard round the world. The Queen Street jail did not have clocks. It measured time in dripping water, scurrying rats, and the groans of the condemned. Eleanor Sterling sat on a pile of damp, moldy straw in the corner of a holding cell. The stone walls were slick with condensation, sweating the misery of 100 years of Boston's criminals. There was no window, only a narrow barred grate high up near the ceiling that let in a siver of gray, indifferent light. She was cold. Her dress, still stiff with the dried salt of the harbor and the mud of the tunnel, chafed against her skin. Her hands were raw, the knuckles skinned and bloody, but she felt none of it. She was numb. A great, hollow silence had opened up inside her chest where her heart used to be. He is dead. The thought circled her mind like a vulture. Papa is dead, and I killed him. She closed her eyes and saw him again, slumped against the wall of the shop, the soldiers smashing the glass. The look of confusion and fear in his eyes as his heart gave out. He had died believing she had fixed the clock. He had died believing in order. "You should eat, girl." The voice was gruff. Eleanor opened her eyes. Standing on the other side of the heavy iron bars was the jailer. He was a massive man with a face like a slab of suet, holding a wooden bowl of gruel. "I am not hungry," Eleanor whispered. Her voice sounded rusty, unused. "Suit yourself," the jailer grunted, placing the bowl on the floor outside the bars. "But you'll need your strength. The general is in a foul mood. They say he's drafting the warrant for your hanging." He paused, tilting his head. Though, he might be too busy for a hanging today. Eleanor looked up, a flicker of curiosity piercing her grief. "Busy? Haven't you heard?" The jailer gestured vaguely toward the ceiling, toward the street above. "The whole town is buzzing like a kicked hive. The troops marched out last night. Hundreds of them, crossed to Cambridge." Eleanor's breath hitched. Revere made it. "And now," the jailer chuckled darkly, "rumor is they've run into a bit of trouble. Farmers with muskets, pitchforks." He walked away, his keys jangling. "War's started, Missy, and you're on the wrong side of the bars." Eleanor was left alone again. War. She leaned her head back against the cold stone. She had wanted to stop the tea. She had wanted to save the powder. But war. The reality of it was heavy and suffocating. It meant cannon fire. It meant burning houses. It meant more men like her father dying in their chairs. And then it started. At first, it was a single sound, a deep, resonant bong that vibrated through the stone floor. Then another, and another. It wasn't the rhythmic, polite chiming of the hour. It was a frantic, chaotic tolling. Clang, clang, clang. Eleanor stood up. She moved to the center of the cell, looking up at the high grate. It was the bells. All of them. The Old South Meeting House. The Brattle Street Church. And distinct among them, the deep, authoritative voice of the Old North Church. The very tower she had stood in yesterday. They were not ringing for church. They were ringing the alarm. The bell tower's warning. It was a sound Boston had not heard in a generation. It was the sound of a city screaming. "They know," Eleanor whispered. "The news has reached the city." The noise from the street filtered down through the grate. It wasn't the usual morning sounds of carts and hawkers. It was the sound of running feet, shouts, the rattle of drums. "To arms! To the neck! They are killing our men at Lexington! Close the shops! Bar the doors!" The energy in the air changed. The prison, usually a place of stagnation, became charged with electricity. In the other cells, prisoners began to shout and bang their tin cups against the bars. "Liberty! Liberty and property!" Eleanor gripped the bars of her cell. The iron was cold, but her hands were burning. The heavy door at the end of the corridor banged open. Boots on stone, hard, fast, angry. Captain Hale appeared. He looked nothing like the composed officer who had arrested her hours ago. His uniform was dusty. His wig was gone, his hair tied back severely with a leather thong. There was a smudge of gunpowder on his cheek, and his eyes were wide, rimmed with red. He marched straight to her cell. He didn't have the keys. He grabbed the bars with gloved hands and shook them, a futile gesture of frustration. "You hear that?" Hale shouted over the clamor of the bells. "Do you hear that music, Miss Sterling?" "I hear the bells, Captain," Eleanor said calmly. "It is a dirge," Hale spat. "They are ringing for the dead. My dead." He paced in front of the cell, agitated. "The reports are coming in. Smith's brigade. Ambushed. At Lexington Green. They fired on the militia. And now the whole damn countryside is pouring out of the woodwork. They are shooting from behind trees. From stone walls. It is not a battle. It is an execution." He stopped and glared at her. "Because they were ready. Because they knew we were coming. Because you bought them the time to wake up." "I did what was necessary," Eleanor said. "Necessary." Hale laughed, a frantic, high-pitched sound. "Do you know who led the column? Major Pitcairn, a good man. And now he is trapped on the road to Concord, surrounded by savages." He slammed his fist against the stone wall. "I should shoot you right now, through the bars. It would be justice." He drew his pistol. Eleanor didn't flinch. She looked at the black muzzle of the gun. After the drowning tunnel, after her father's death, a bullet seemed like a mercy. "Do it," she said softly. "It won't stop the bells, Captain. And it won't bring your men back." Hale's hand trembled. The bells outside grew louder, a cacophony of defiance. Clang, clang, clang. He looked at her. He saw the grief in her eyes, but also the steel. He saw a woman who had already lost everything, and therefore had nothing left to fear. Slowly, Hale lowered the pistol. "No," he whispered. "That is too easy. You want to be a martyr, Eleanor. You want to be the Joan of Arc of Boston." He holstered the gun. "You will stay here," Hale said, his voice dropping to a cruel monotone. "We are locking down the city. General Gage has declared martial law. No one enters. No one leaves. Boston is now a prison." He stepped closer to the bars. "And you will sit in this cell and listen. You will listen to the cannons. You will listen to the screams as we burn Charlestown. You will listen as we crush this rebellion. And when it is over, when the last patriot is hanged, then I will come for you." "You will try," Eleanor said. "I will succeed," Hale promised. "Because order always wins against chaos, eventually." "Not today," Eleanor replied. "Today." The clock struck 13. Hale stared at her for one last moment, a look of hatred mixed with a grudging, painful respect. Then he turned on his heel. "Guard!" Hale shouted. "Double the watch! If this woman escapes, I will skin you alive!" He stormed out, leaving the heavy door slightly ajar in his haste. The jailer returned, looking pale and frightened. He sat on his stool at the end of the corridor, clutching a musket. He didn't look at Eleanor. He was listening to the street. Eleanor sank back onto the straw. The confrontation had drained her, but it had also ignited something. Hale was afraid. The British Army, the greatest fighting force in the world, was afraid. She looked up at the grate again. Through the bars, she could see a slice of the sky. It was blue now, the fog burned away by the morning sun. And then she saw it. A bird, a simple sparrow, flitting past the grate, landing on the ledge for a brief second, before flying off. Free. The bells continued to ring. But now, to Eleanor's ears, they didn't sound like an alarm anymore. They sounded like a heartbeat, the heartbeat of a new nation waking up. She reached into her bodice. Hidden in the lining, safe from the search, was a single small gear she had pocketed from her father's shop floor before they dragged her away. A small brass wheel. She held it in her palm, pressing the metal until it hurt. "I am not a martyr," she whispered to the darkness. "I am a mechanic, and I still have work to do." Outside the jail, Queen Street. The street was a river of panic. Merchants were boarding up their windows. Women were dragging children indoors. Loyalists were packing wagons, heading for the safety of the wharves and the British ships. Patriots were gathering in alleys, whispering, clutching hidden knives and clubs. In the crowd, a figure moved with purpose. He wore a rough wool coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He was muddy, smelling of the river. Julian Thorne. He had not stayed in Medford. He had not ridden to Concord. He had swum back, against the tide, against the logic of survival. He moved through the crowd, invisible in the chaos. He reached the corner of Queen Street and looked up at the grim stone facade of the jail. He saw the barred grate near the ground level. He couldn't storm the prison, not alone. Not today. The street was filled with redcoats reinforcing the barricades. But he could send a signal. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of rocks. He waited until a squad of soldiers marched past, their drums drowning out all other sound. He threw the rocks, not at the soldiers, but at the bell tower of the old brick church across the street. Ping, ping. It was nothing compared to the great tolling of the bells. But he looked back at the prison grate. He saw a hand appear, a pale, slender hand, gripping the bars. It held something small and shiny that caught the sun. A piece of brass. Julian smiled, though tears stung his eyes. She was alive. He turned to the man next to him, a blacksmith with soot on his face. "What is the news?" Julian asked, feigning ignorance. "War, lad," the blacksmith spat, gripping a heavy iron hammer. "They say the regulars are retreating from Concord, running back to Boston with their tails between their legs. Percy is marching out to save them. Then they will be distracted," Julian said softly. "Aye," the blacksmith nodded. "The wolf is busy fighting the bear. The sheep might have a chance." "We are not sheep," Julian said, his hand resting on the pistol beneath his coat. "Not anymore." He looked back at the prison one last time. "Hold on, El," he whispered. "The bells are ringing for them. But the night is coming for us." He slipped away into the crowd, moving toward the north end, toward the Green Dragon. Toward the tunnels. The bell tower's warning had been heard. The time for waiting was over. The time for breaking walls had begun. Aapnar, Anurod, Anuyayi, Shadows of Liberty. Glper, Debaj, Adhyai. A spark in the powder keg. Nice Deoya, hello. Yehetu, Thandia 500 Shbed Ekti Ekchat Responser, Jnianek Dirkeben Technical, Karne Majab te Kete Yete Pare, Tayami Galper Ekti Atint Bistaret, Eben Gabhir Brannamulk, Ansh, Prayedotaun. Tichi. Etie Adhye Yer Mulkutna Praba. Eben Klimeakske Kapar Krube. Shadows of Liberty. Candlelight in Old Boston. Chapter 12. A Spark in the Powder Keg. The sun began to set on the 19th of April, 1775, but the sky over Boston remained a bruised, angry purple. It was not the color of twilight. It was the color of smoke, dust, and dried blood suspended in the stagnant air. To the west, across the Charles River, the horizon was burning. Inside the Queen Street jail, the air had become unbreathable. The stone walls, usually damp and cold, now felt feverish. The prison was vibrating. It wasn't an earthquake, but the rhythmic, terrifying thud of thousands of boots dragging against the cobblestones outside. Eleanor Sterling stood on her toes, gripping the high iron bars of her cell's grate. She couldn't see the street, but she could hear it. It was the sound of a funeral march. but one devoid of dignity. Make way! Make way for the wounded! Water, for God's sake, water! The devils! They are behind every wall, every tree. The British Army, General Gage's invincible machine, was limping back into the city. They weren't marching in the crisp, terrifying formations Eleanor had watched for years. They were stumbling. The Invincibles were broken. "Sounds like hell has opened up," the jailer muttered. He was no longer sitting on his stool. He was pacing the corridor, his keys jangling nervously. He kept glancing at the heavy oak door, as if expecting the militia to burst through it at any moment. "It sounds like defeat," Eleanor said softly. The jailer spun around, his face flushed. "Watch your tongue, traitor. Lord Percy has gone out with the relief column. They'll crush your farmers into the mud." "Listen to them," Eleanor challenged, gesturing to the grate. "Do those sound like men who have crushed anything? Or do they sound like men who have been running for their lives?" The jailer didn't answer. He couldn't, because just then, a cannon fired from the harbor. Boom! The shock wave shook dust from the ceiling. The Somerset is covering the retreat, Eleanor realized. They are crossing at Charlestown. They are trapped. Boston was no longer just an occupied city. It was a besieged fortress. And inside a fortress under siege, the first casualty is mercy. The Commons, British Artillery Park. Captain Hale sat on the wheel of a 12-pounder cannon, his head in his hands. He had not ridden to Concord. He had been assigned to hold the Neck, the narrow strip of land connecting Boston to the mainland. All day, he had watched the carnage from a distance. He had watched the smoke rise from Lexington. He had watched the ragged remnants of Colonel Smith's expedition stream back across the narrow causeway, harassed by a swarm of angry provincials who fired and vanished like ghosts. He looked up. His uniform was pristine, unlike the men stumbling past him, but his soul felt stained. "Captain," a lieutenant approached, saluting wearily. "General Gage orders a full lockdown. The city gates are shut. No civilian movement after sunset. Shoot on sight. Shoot on sight," Hale repeated hollowly. "We are shooting our own subjects now. They are rebels, sir. They killed Major Pitcairn's horse. They scalped a soldier at the bridge. They are savages." Hale stood up. He adjusted his sword belt. "They are not savages, Lieutenant. They are us, with better aim." He looked toward the north, toward the spire of the Old North Church. Then his gaze drifted to the dark stone bulk of the Queen Street jail. "What of the prisoners?" Hale asked. "The general says the prison is a liability. If the mob rises inside the city tonight to join the militia outside, the jail will be their first target. They will try to free their friends. And we cannot spare men to guard it. We need every bayonet on the perimeter." The lieutenant hesitated, then lowered his voice. "The order is to secure the prisoners. If the mob attacks, we are to ensure the prisoners do not escape. By any means." Hale felt a chill settle in his stomach. By any means. That meant execution. If the Sons of Liberty tried to break Eleanor out, the guards would kill her before letting her go. "I will take command of the jail detail," Hale said abruptly. "Sir, but your place is with the regiment." "My place is where I say it is," Hale snapped, his composure cracking for a fraction of a second. "The jail is a critical point. I will secure it personally." He strode away before the lieutenant could argue. He walked through the chaotic camp on the common. Soldiers were collapsing on the grass, exhausted. Surgeons were sawing limbs by torchlight. Hale walked fast. He told himself he was going to the prison to do his duty, to secure a traitor. But deep down in the part of his mind he tried to drown with brandy, he knew the truth. He was going there because he was the only thing standing between Eleanor Sterling and a massacre. The Green Dragon Tavern, the cellar. The tavern above was silent. shuttered tight against the martial law. But the cellar was a hive of desperate energy. Julian Thorne spread a map of Boston on a hogshead barrel. The map was stained with ale and candle wax. "We don't have time," Julian said, his voice hoarse. "Gage has closed the neck. The city is sealed. We are trapped in here with them. And they are angry," Paul Revere said. He had managed to slip back into the city by boat before the blockade tightened. A reckless move that only a man of his courage would attempt. He looked exhausted, mud caked to his eyebrows. "I saw them on the road, Julian. They are not looking to arrest people anymore. They are looking for revenge. Eleanor is in Queen Street," Julian said, pointing to the square on the map. "Hale took her. If the fighting starts in the city, if the mob tries to rise, they will kill the prisoners," Revere finished the thought. "It is standard procedure in a siege. Eliminate internal threats." "Then we have to get her out. Tonight." "How?" asked Robert Newman, the sexton who had unlocked the church tower the night before. "The street is crawling with redcoats. The jail is a fortress." Julian looked at the map. He looked at the layout of the streets. "We can't fight them," Julian said. "Not head on. There are too many of them, and we have only pistols and knives. We need a distraction. A big one." "A fire?" Newman suggested. "Wood structures. The wind is high." "No," Revere shook his head. "If we burn the city, we burn our own homes. We are not savages." "Not a fire," Julian said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the map. He traced a line from the common to the harbor. "A spark, in the powder keg." He pointed to a building near the common. "The magazine. The British store their reserve powder and shot in the brick shed, behind the guardhouse. If that were to go up, it would blow half the common apart," Revere said, eyes widening. "It would draw every soldier in the city to put out the fire and save the munitions," Julian argued. "They would pull the guards from the jail. Panic, chaos. In that smoke, we can breach the prison wall." "It is suicide," Newman whispered. "The guardhouse is the most heavily defended spot in Boston." "Not tonight," Julian said. "Tonight they are exhausted. They are tending to their wounded. They are watching the perimeter, looking out for the militia. They aren't looking in." He looked at Revere. "You rode to save the countryside, Paul. Let me ride to save her." Revere studied the boy. He saw the transformation. The reckless youth who handed out pamphlets was gone. In his place was a tactician. "We have 2 kegs of black powder here," Revere said quietly, "left over from the raid." "That should be enough," Julian said. "It is a spark, all right," Revere nodded grimly. "If this goes wrong, Julian, you won't just die. You will be vaporized. Then I won't have to worry about the hanging." Julian gave a tight, humorless smile. "Prepare the cart," Revere ordered the men. "Cover the kegs with hay. We move in 10 minutes. Queen Street, 9 o'clock p.m. Eleanor had stopped watching the grate. It was too dark now. She sat on the straw, holding the small brass gear she had saved. It was her talisman. Gear, lever, spring, order. The door opened. She didn't look up. She expected the jailer with more gruel. "Get up!" She looked up. Captain Hale stood there. He was alone. He had a lantern in one hand and a set of keys in the other. "Captain," she said, "have you come to carry out the sentence?" "I have come to move you," Hale said. He unlocked the cell door. The metal screeched, a sound that grated on her nerves. "The lower cells are not safe. The damp, it breeds fever." "You care about my health now?" Eleanor stood up slowly. "After destroying my life, I am moving you to the upper holding room," Hale said, ignoring her barb. "It has a window and a stove. Eleanor stepped out of the cell. She looked at him. He looked terrible. The confident aristocrat was gone. He looked like a man holding onto a crumbling cliff edge. "Why?" she asked. "Because I am tired, Eleanor," Hale whispered. "And I do not wish to hear you cough your lungs out in the dark like your father." The mention of her father stung, but she saw something else in his eyes. Guilt? No. Hale was too proud for guilt. It was fear. He was moving her to the upper room because the lower cells were a death trap if the prison was stormed or burned. He marched her up the narrow stone stairs. The upper holding room was indeed better. It was the guard captain's office, repurposed. There was a desk, a chair, and a small coal stove. But the door was thick oak, reinforced with iron bands. Hale locked her in. "Do not go near the window," he ordered through the small viewing hatch. "The sentries have orders to fire at any shadow." "Hale," she called out before he could leave. He paused. "The retreat," she said. "Was it bad?" Hale was silent for a long moment. "We marched out with 1,200 men. We came back with fewer. The road was lined with fire." "Then you know," she said. "You know it cannot be stopped." "We shall see," Hale said. "Sleep, Eleanor. Tomorrow brings a new world." He walked away. Eleanor went to the window. She stayed to the side, peering out carefully. She could see the common in the distance. It was a sea of tents and campfires. The British Army was licking its wounds. She looked down at the street directly below. Queen Street was empty, save for a double patrol of redcoats marching nervously. Then she saw it. A cart, a simple, rickety hay cart, creaking slowly down the side alley toward the common. It was being pulled by a man, not a horse. A man in a rough coat. He stopped the cart near the brick wall of the magazine, the powder store. The sentries on the common shouted, "Halt! Who goes there?" The man didn't answer. He unhitched the cart. He reached into the hay. Eleanor pressed her face against the glass. "Julian?" She saw a flash of flint and steel. A spark. Then the man turned and ran. He ran with a desperate, frantic speed, diving into the shadows of a doorway, just as the sentries raised their muskets. "Fire!" a sentry screamed. The muskets cracked. Bang! Bang! But they were too late. The spark had caught the fuse. For a second, there was nothing. Just the cart sitting innocuously by the wall. And then, the world turned white. Kaboom! The explosion was not a sound. It was a physical blow. The shockwave hit the prison. The glass of Eleanor's window shattered inward, showering the room with shards. She was thrown backward, crashing into the desk. The floor heaved. Dust rained from the ceiling. Outside, the night sky was ripped apart by a tower of orange flame. The British magazine had detonated. The sound was followed instantly by the screams of the city. "Fire! The magazine is hit! They are shelling us! To the common! Save the artillery!" Eleanor scrambled to her feet, coughing in the dust. Her ears were ringing. She ran to the broken window. The common was in chaos. Tents were on fire. Horses were stampeding. Every soldier in the vicinity was running toward the blast, buckets in hand, desperate to prevent the fire from spreading to the main barracks. And in that chaos, she saw the street below the prison. The guards at the gate were looking at the fire, their mouths open in shock. "The rebels are attacking!" one shouted. "To the magazine!" They abandoned their post. They ran toward the fire, drawn by the spectacle and the duty. The street in front of the jail was empty, except for 3 figures emerging from the smoke. Julian, Paul Revere, and Robert Newman. They carried sledgehammers and a heavy iron pry bar. They ran to the main door of the jail. Eleanor grabbed the bars of her cell door. "Julian!" she screamed, though she couldn't hear herself over the ringing in her ears. Downstairs, she heard the splintering of wood. Crack, smash. They were breaking in, but footsteps were coming up the stairs too. Inside the prison, Hale. He burst into the corridor outside her room. He had a pistol in his hand. He looked wild, his coat covered in plaster dust. "I told you!" Hale shouted, his eyes manic. "I told you it would happen. They have come for you." He fumbled with the keys. He wasn't trying to let her out. He was trying to double lock the door. Or perhaps, enter and finish it. "Stay back!" Eleanor yelled. "The prison is collapsing!" "Let it collapse!" Hale screamed. "But you will not leave!" He jammed the key into the lock. From the stairwell behind him, a voice roared. "Hale!" Hale spun around, raising his pistol. Julian Thorne stood at the top of the stairs. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, his clothes singed by the explosion. He held a heavy horse pistol in his hand. "Drop it," Julian warned. He was breathless, chest heaving. "You," Hale sneered. "The boy who plays with fire." "The boy who burned your powder," Julian corrected. "Open the door, Captain, and walk away." "Never," Hale said. He fired. Bang! The ball struck the doorframe inches from Julian's head, sending splinters flying. Julian flinched but didn't retreat. Hale cocked his second pistol. But Eleanor was moving. Through the viewing hatch, she saw Hale's back pressed against the door. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the coal stove, the same weapon she had held in her hallway nights ago. She jammed it through the bars of the viewing hatch. She thrust it with all her strength. The hot iron struck Hale in the shoulder, right on his wound from the brick. Hale screamed, dropping the pistol. He staggered forward, away from the door. Julian didn't hesitate. He lunged. He tackled Hale. The two men crashed to the floor of the corridor. They rolled, grappling, punching. Hale was stronger, trained in combat. He landed a brutal blow to Julian's jaw. Julian fell back, dazed. Hale reached for his dropped pistol. "No!" Eleanor screamed. She rattled the door handle. It was locked from the outside. Hale gripped the pistol. He aimed it at Julian's chest. "Order!" Hale panted, blood dripping from his nose. "Restored." Click. The pistol misfired. The flint struck, but the powder in the pan didn't ignite. Maybe it was the damp air of the prison. Maybe it was the dust from the explosion. Or maybe it was just luck. Julian kicked the gun from Hale's hand. He scrambled up and grabbed the ring of keys from Hale's belt. He didn't kill Hale. He didn't have time. He shoved Hale backward, sending the exhausted officer tumbling down the stone stairs. Julian turned to the door. His hands were shaking violently. He tried one key. Wrong. Two keys. Wrong. "Hurry!" Eleanor cried. The guards will be back." Third key. Click. The bolt slid back. The door swung open. Eleanor stumbled out. She fell into Julian's arms. He smelled of smoke, sweat, and gunpowder. The smell of freedom. "I told you I was coming," Julian gasped, holding her tight for a second. "The spark," Eleanor whispered, looking at his singed coat. "You were the spark." "We have to go," Revere's voice came from the stairs. "The fire is dying down. The patrol is returning." They ran. They ran down the stairs, stepping over the unconscious or groaning body of Captain Hale. Eleanor paused for a fraction of a second. She looked at the man who had tried to save her by imprisoning her. "Goodbye, Captain," she whispered. They burst out onto Queen Street. The air was thick with acrid smoke. The sky glowed orange. "To the alley!" Revere shouted. "We have a wagon waiting near the wharf." They sprinted through the darkened streets of Boston. Behind them, the bells of the city began to ring again, not in alarm this time, but in chaos. As they turned the corner, Eleanor looked back. The Queen Street jail stood silhouetted against the flames of the magazine. It looked like a tomb that had been broken open. She was out, but the city was burning. "Where do we go?" she asked, running beside Julian. "North," Julian said. "Past the lines, to the army in Cambridge."
"I have no home there," Eleanor said. Julian reached out and took her hand as they ran. "We will build a new one," he said, "after we win." They disappeared into the smoke just as the first squad of furious redcoats turned the corner, bayonets gleaming in the firelight, searching for the ghosts that had slipped through their fingers. Boston was not a grid, it was a tangle. Founded by Puritans who believed in the straight path to heaven, but built their roads on the wandering trails of cattle, the city was a labyrinth of crooked lanes, dead ends, and narrow alleys that defied logic. To an invading army, this layout was a nightmare. To Eleanor Sterling, it was the only hope of survival. They ran. They did not run down King Street or Cornhill, the wide thoroughfares where the gas lamps still sputtered and where the British patrols were now massing like angry wasps. They ran through the veins of the city, the dark, stinking gaps between warehouses, the muddy paths behind stables, the slivers of space between brick tenements where the moonlight barely touched the ground. Eleanor's lungs burned. Every breath tasted of the sulfur from the explosion. The sound of the blast was gone, replaced by a terrifying, chaotic din. Alarm bells clanging, officers blowing whistles, and the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on cobblestones. "Left!" Paul Revere hissed, grabbing Julian's shoulder and shoving him toward a black opening in a brick wall. They dove into the alley just as a squad of grenadiers marched past the mouth of the passage. The soldiers were running toward the fires on the common, their bayonets flashing red in the reflection of the flames. "They are everywhere," Julian gasped, leaning against the damp brick. He was supporting Eleanor, his arm wrapped tight around her waist. Eleanor slid down the wall, her legs trembling. The adrenaline of the prison break was fading, replaced by a crushing exhaustion. She looked at her hands. They were black with soot, trembling uncontrollably. "We can't go to the wharves," Robert Newman whispered. The sexton was pale, clutching his heavy iron pry bar like a holy relic. "The waterfront is sealed. The Somerset has lowered her longboats. They are patrolling the docks." "We aren't going to the docks," Revere said. He was checking the load in his pistol, his face grim. "We are going to the mill pond." "The mill pond?" Julian asked. "That's a dead end. It's just mud and tidal flats." "Exactly," Revere said. The British don't patrol the mud. They don't think anyone is foolish enough to try and cross the causeway when the tide is out." He looked at Eleanor. "Can you move, lass? It's a mile. Uphill, then through the marsh." Eleanor looked up. She thought of her father's body lying in the ruined shop. She thought of Captain Hale bleeding on the prison stairs. There was no going back. Her past was a burning house. Her future was a mud flat. "I can move," she said. She forced herself to stand. I know the alleys better than you, Mr. Revere." Revere raised an eyebrow. "You deliver silver to the rich on the main streets," Eleanor said, her voice gathering strength. "I delivered clocks to the poor in the tenements. I know the shortcuts." She pointed to the end of the alley. "That way leads to Hanover Street. It will be blocked. But if we cut through the tanner's yard, there is a gap in the fence that leads to the burying ground on Copp's Hill." Revere smiled, a flash of white teeth in a soot-stained face. "Lead on, Miss Sterling." The tanner's yard. The smell hit them first, urine, lime, and rotting flesh. The tanner's yard was a place most Bostonians avoided, but tonight it was a sanctuary. They moved silently through the rows of drying hides, which hung like ghostly curtains in the dark. Eleanor led the way. She moved with a strange, fluid grace. She was no longer the clockmaker who sat still at a bench. She was a creature of the night. She knew which boards in the fence were loose. She knew which dogs barked and which ones could be silenced with a whisper. They reached the fence. Eleanor found the gap. 2 missing palings hidden behind a stack of oak bark. She squeezed through. Julian followed, then Newman. Revere, stockier than the others, had to turn sideways and suck in his breath, scraping his buttons against the wood. They emerged into a narrow lane behind the Old North Church. The tower loomed above them, silent now. The lanterns that had signaled the world 2 nights ago were gone. The windows were dark. "My church," Newman whispered, looking up at the spire with longing. I may never unlock those doors again. You unlocked a nation, Robert, Revere said, clapping him on the back. That is enough for one lifetime. Quiet, Julian warned. He pulled them into the shadow of a carriage house. A patrol was coming down the lane. Not a running squad this time, but a slow, methodical search party. They were checking doors, kicking them in, dragging people out. By order of General Gage, a sergeant shouted. All houses to be searched. Harboring traitors is a hanging offense. Eleanor watched through a crack in the carriage house door. She saw a woman, Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, being shoved onto the street in her nightdress, clutching a baby. I have no rebels here, Mrs. Gable screamed. My husband is with the king's army. Search the cellar, the sergeant ordered, ignoring her. Eleanor felt a surge of rage so hot it nearly blinded her. This was her neighborhood. These were her people. We have to help her, Eleanor whispered, reaching for the heavy iron pry bar in Newman's hand. Julian grabbed her wrist. No! They are hurting her! If we engage them, Julian hissed, his eyes intense. We die. And the message we carry, the truth of what happened tonight, dies with us. Mrs. Gable will survive a search. She will not survive a firefight in her doorway. Eleanor looked at him. He was right. It was the brutal calculus of war. She hated it. We move while they are inside, Julian said. Now! They slipped out of the carriage house while the soldiers were ransacking the bakery. They crossed the lane like shadows, flitting from one patch of darkness to the next. They reached the base of Copp's Hill. This was the high ground. The British had an artillery battery here aiming cannons at Charlestown. We have to go through the burying ground, Eleanor whispered. The battery guards face the water. They won't be looking at the graves. They climbed the stone wall of the cemetery. The burying ground was a city of the dead. Slate headstones leaned at crazy angles, etched with winged skulls and hourglasses. Tempus fugit, time flies. Eleanor crept among the graves. She recognized the names, the Mathers, the Cottons, the ancestors of the men now fighting in the woods of Concord. They reached the crest of the hill. Below them, to the north, lay the Charles River and the Mill Pond. It was a desolate sight. The tide was out. The pond was a vast expanse of glistening gray mud, intersected by narrow channels of black water. There, Revere pointed. The causeway. It's a narrow dam. If we can crawl along the side of it, we can reach the mainland. And if we slip? Newman asked. Then you drown in the muck, Revere said simply. Or the redcoats on the battery see you and use you for target practice. They began the descent. The slope of Copp's Hill was steep and grassy. They slid down on their backsides, careful not to silhouette themselves against the sky. They reached the edge of the mill pond. The smell of low tide was overpowering, rotten eggs and salt. Single file, Revere ordered. Step where I step. There are sinkholes in this mud that will swallow a horse. They stepped onto the mud. It sucked at their boots. Schloop, schlup. It was heavy, wet, and cold. Eleanor was third in line. She focused on Julian's back. She focused on his coat, torn and stained. They were halfway across the tidal flat when the light hit them. It wasn't a searchlight, it was a flare. Not from the Somerset, but from the battery on Copp's Hill behind them. The British were firing illumination rounds to check the perimeter. Freeze, Revere hissed. They froze. They stood knee-deep in the mud, exposed, vulnerable. The flare hung in the sky, a burning white star. It illuminated the mud flat with a harsh, merciless glare. Eleanor held her breath. She felt like an insect pinned to a card. If a sentry looked down, if a telescope swept this way, she could see her own shadow stretching long across the mud. Don't move. Don't breathe. The flare sizzled, sputtered, and began to drift down. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. It hit the water with a hiss and went out. Darkness rushed back in. Move, Revere whispered. Double time. They scrambled. They didn't care about the noise now. They sloshed through the muck, falling, getting up, covered in slime. They reached the causeway, a stone dam that separated the pond from the river. They climbed up the slippery rocks, hiding in the lee of the wall. We made it, Newman gasped, wiping mud from his eyes. We are out of the city? Not yet, Julian said. He pointed ahead. At the end of the causeway where the road turned toward Cambridge, there was a checkpoint. A bonfire was burning. Soldiers were standing guard, their silhouettes sharp against the flames. A barricade of wagons blocked the road. "We can't get past that," Newman said, defeated. "It's the only road off the dam." Revere looked at the water. The Charles River was on their right. The current was swift, even at low tide. "We swim," Revere said. "In this?" Newman looked at the icy water. "It's suicide, Paul. We are exhausted. We are weighed down by clothes." "I can't swim," Eleanor said softly. The three men looked at her. "I grew up in a shop," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I never learned." Silence. They were trapped. The checkpoint ahead, the mud behind, the river to the right. "There is a boat," Julian said suddenly. "What?" Revere asked. "Look." Julian pointed to the base of the causeway wall near the checkpoint, but hidden in the shadows. There was a small skiff tied to a rotting piling. It was likely used by the dam keeper or a fisherman checking traps. "It's right under their noses," Newman whispered, 20 yards from the sentries. "It's the only way," Julian said. He looked at Eleanor. He took her muddy hands in his. "I will get the boat," Julian said. "Paul, you take Eleanor and Robert down the rocks to the water's edge. Wait for me." "It's too dangerous, Julian," Eleanor said, gripping his hands. "If they see you—" "They won't see me," Julian said. He smiled, that same reckless, charming smile she had seen in the tavern. "I am the spark, remember?" He kissed her hands. Then he turned and crawled away along the top of the wall, moving toward the bonfire and the soldiers. Eleanor watched him go. She wanted to call him back. She wanted to scream, but she stayed silent. Revere guided her down the slippery rocks to the water. They crouched in the freezing darkness, listening. They heard the laughter of the soldiers at the checkpoint. They heard the crackle of the fire. And then, a small splash. Eleanor strained her eyes. She saw the skiff moving. It was drifting away from the piling, but it wasn't empty. A figure was lying flat in the bottom, pulling the boat along the wall by hand, inch by inch. It was agonizingly slow. The boat drifted closer to them. 10 yards, 5 yards. Suddenly, a soldier at the checkpoint shouted, "Hey, did you hear that?" The boat stopped moving. "Hear what?" another soldier asked. "Splash, like an oar." The soldier walked to the edge of the wall. He held his lantern out over the water. The light swung out. It illuminated the black water. It swung toward the boat. Eleanor closed her eyes. "Please, not now." The soldier peered into the dark. "Just a log," the soldier grunted. "Or a dead seal. Tide's turning." He walked back to the fire. The boat started moving again. It reached them. Julian popped his head up. He was soaking wet, shivering, but grinning. "Your carriage awaits, madam," he whispered. They scrambled into the skiff. It was small, leaky, and smelled of fish. It was the most beautiful thing Eleanor had ever seen. Revere took the oars. He didn't row. He paddled, keeping the blades underwater to avoid splashing. They drifted, away from the wall, away from the checkpoint, away from the fires of Boston. The current caught them. It pulled them out into the center of the river. Only then did Revere begin to row in earnest. His powerful strokes cut through the water, putting distance between them and the prison they had left behind. Eleanor sat in the stern, looking back. Boston was a silhouette of jagged roofs and steeples against a glowing sky. It looked small from here, contained. "We are out," Newman breathed, clutching his chest. Eleanor looked at Julian. He was sitting in the bow, staring at the city. "We are out," Julian agreed, but we are not leaving." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked. Julian pointed to the hills surrounding the city, to Dorchester Heights, to Bunker Hill. "Look," he said. Eleanor looked. At first, she saw only darkness. But then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw them. Hundreds, no, thousands of tiny pinpricks of light. Campfires. They ringed the city. They were on the hills of Roxbury, the shores of Cambridge, the heights of Charlestown. The countryside had awakened. The farmers, the shopkeepers, the blacksmiths, they hadn't gone home after Lexington. They had followed the British back. They were besieging the besiegers. "The army," Revere whispered in awe. "The army of observation. They are all here." Eleanor felt a lump in her throat. Her father's shop was gone. Her home was a prison. But looking at those thousands of fires, she realized something. She wasn't homeless. "Row, Mr. Revere," Eleanor said, her voice strong and clear over the sound of the water. "Row us to the fires." Revere pulled the oars. The little skiff surged forward, cutting through the black water, carrying them away from the narrow alleys of the past and into the wide, dangerous, and hopeful horizon of the Revolution. The Charles River did not give them up easily. It clung to their clothes, cold and heavy, until the very last moment when the keel of the small skiff scraped against the gravel of the Cambridge shore. They had landed in a marshy inlet far from the main road, guided only by the distant, flickering glow of the militia campfires. Paul Revere was the first to step out. He dragged the boat onto the mud, his breathing ragged. He looked like a man made of clay, covered in soot from the explosion, mud from the mill pond, and salt from the river. "We are here," Revere rasped. "Cambridge, the seat of the rebellion." Julian Thorne helped Eleanor out of the boat. Her legs were numb, refusing to hold her weight for a moment. She stumbled and he caught her. "I have you," Julian whispered. "Walk. Just a little further." To the fires. They trudged up the bank, moving through tall, frosted grass that whipped against their wet shins. The silence of the river was replaced by a low, humming vibration, the sound of thousands of men, animals, and wagons moving in the dark. They reached the perimeter of the camp near dawn. It was not an army, it was a gathering. There were no neat rows of white tents like the British had on the common. There were lean-tos made of sailcloth, huts built from fence rails and sod, and men sleeping in the open, wrapped in blankets woven on home looms. A sentry stepped out from behind a stone wall. He was an old man holding a fowling piece that looked older than he was. "Halt! Who goes there?" "Patriots!" Revere called out, raising his hands. "Paul Revere, from Boston, and refugees." The sentry lowered his gun, squinting. "Revere, the writer? We heard you were taken by the patrol." "I am hard to keep," Revere said grimly. "Take us to General Ward, or at least to a fire. This woman is freezing." The sentry whistled. Two younger men appeared, farm boys with eager, frightened eyes. They led the group into the heart of the camp. As they walked, Eleanor looked around. She saw blacksmiths sharpening scythes into swords. She saw women, camp followers, wives, daughters, stirring massive iron pots of porridge. She saw men cleaning muskets, their faces illuminated by the firelight, looking toward the city across the water with a mixture of hatred and longing. They were brought to a large farmhouse that had been commandeered as a headquarters. The yard was filled with couriers coming and going, horses steaming in the cold air. Revere went inside to give his report, to tell them of the explosion, the confusion in the city, the escape. Julian and Eleanor were led to a barn where a triage station had been set up. A doctor, his apron stained with the blood of yesterday's battle, looked them over. "Exhaustion," the doctor diagnosed, handing them blankets and a flask of cider. "And shock? Sit, warm up. There is nothing else to be done tonight." They sat on a pile of hay near the door, wrapped in the rough wool blankets. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The adrenaline that had fueled their escape was gone, leaving behind a hollow ache. Eleanor stared at her hands. The grime of the city was still embedded in her skin. She rubbed her thumb over the callus on her finger, the mark of a clockmaker. "My father," she said softly. Julian turned to her. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He reached out and took her hand, covering the callus with his own. "I know," he said. "He died afraid," Eleanor whispered. "He died thinking the world had broken." "He died protecting you," Julian corrected. "In the end, Elle, he stood in front of that clock. He made his choice. He wasn't a loyalist in that moment. He was a father." Tears finally came, not the hysterical sobbing of the night before, but a slow, silent release of grief. Eleanor leaned her head against Julian's shoulder. He smelled of smoke and river water, but underneath he smelled of life. "What do we do now?" she asked. "I have no tools, I have no shop, I have no home." Julian looked out the barn door. The sky in the east was beginning to lighten. The deep indigo of the night was bleeding into a pale, bruised gray. "You have a trade," Julian said. "Look around you, Eleanor. This army. It has spirit, but it has no precision. Their muskets misfire. Their cannons have no sights. Their supply wagons run late." He turned to her, his eyes intense. "We don't need another soldier with a musket. We have plenty of those. We need someone who understands how to make things work. How to fix a broken spring. How to time a movement." He squeezed her hand. "General Washington, if he comes, will need engineers. He will need map makers. He will need clock makers. Eleanor looked at him. She thought of the brass gear in her pocket. She thought of the bent rack hook in the church tower. Perhaps, she said.
Sunrise. An hour later, the camp began to stir in earnest. A drum roll echoed from the parade ground. Ragged, out of time, but loud. "Come," Julian said. "You need to see this." He led her out of the barn. They walked up a gentle slope behind the farmhouse, heading toward a ridge that overlooked the Charles River basin. The air was crisp, biting cold, but clean. The smoke of the explosion had drifted out to sea, leaving the atmosphere scrubbed raw. They reached the top of the hill. Below them, the river was a ribbon of steel, reflecting the brightening sky. And, across the water, sitting on its peninsula, like a fortress island, was Boston. It looked small from here. The steeples, the brick rows, the wharves. It was a toy city contained within its own misery. Eleanor could see the smoke still rising from the ruins of the magazine near the common. She could see the black hull of the Somerset patrolling the channel. She could see the British flag hanging limp on the pole at Province House. But then, the sun broke the horizon. It rose not over the land, but over the harbor. A burning sphere of gold pushed up out of the Atlantic Ocean. It cast a blinding, brilliant path of light across the water. The light hit the harbor first. It turned the gray waves into liquid fire. It illuminated the masts of the British ships, exposing them, stripping away the mystery of the fog. Then, the light hit the city. It struck the gold dome of the Province House. It struck the weather vanes. It struck the slate roofs. For a moment, Boston gleamed. It looked beautiful, despite the siege, despite the hunger, despite the tyranny inside. "Dawn over the harbor," Julian whispered. Eleanor watched the light creep across the water toward them. It crossed the river. It touched the mud of the shore. And finally, it touched them. The warmth of the sun on her face felt like a shock. She hadn't realized how cold she had been, cold to her very bones, for the last 48 hours. She took a deep breath. The air tasted of salt and pine needles. "It is a siege," Julian said, looking at the city. "We will starve them out. We will bombard them. It might take months, maybe years. We will wait," Eleanor said. "I am good at waiting. Patience is the first rule of horology." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small brass gear. She held it up to the sun. The light caught the teeth of the wheel, making it shine like a tiny star. "My father believed that the king was the mainspring," Eleanor said, looking at the gear. "That without him, the machine stops." She lowered her hand. She looked at the camp below, the chaotic, messy, vibrant gathering of free men and women. "He was wrong," she said. "The people are the mainspring. We provide the tension. We drive the gears." She turned to Julian. The morning light caught the stubble on his chin, the cut on his forehead, the weariness in his eyes. But it also caught the love. "And you," she said softly. "You are the escapement. You release the energy. Tick by tick." Julian smiled. He reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "And you, Eleanor Sterling, are the hands. You show the world what time it is." He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a desperate kiss like the one in the alley, or a fearful kiss before a battle. It was a slow, deliberate kiss. A promise. When they pulled apart, the sun was fully up. The dawn had broken. Eleanor looked back at Boston one last time. "Let's go," she said, turning her back on the city of her birth and facing the camp of her future. "We have work to do." They walked down the hill together, their long shadows stretching out before them, merging with the shadows of the thousands of others who had woken up to a new world. The candlelight in the colonies had been blown out by the storm, but the sun had risen, and in its light, everything was different. The silence was the loudest thing Boston had ever heard. For 11 months, the city had been a cacophony of siege. The boom of cannons from the neck, the rattle of drums, the shouting of orders, the crying of starving children. It had been a prison of noise and fear, but today, the silence was absolute. Eleanor Sterling stood on the crest of Dorchester Heights. She wore a coat that was patched at the elbows and boots that had marched through the mud of Cambridge and the snow of Roxbury. She looked older than her 25 years. There were fine lines around her eyes, etched by the smoke of campfires and the strain of mapping supply routes for General Washington's quartermaster. Beside her stood Julian Thorne. He wore the blue coat of a Continental Army captain now, though it hung loosely on his frame. The siege had been hard on everyone. He leaned slightly on a cane, a souvenir from a skirmish at Bunker Hill, where a musket ball had grazed his thigh. "They are gone," Julian said quietly. He pointed toward the harbor. The horizon was a forest of canvas. Over 100 British ships, warships, transports, sloops were sailing away. They moved in a solemn, defeated procession, their white sails stark against the gray Atlantic sky. They carried General Howe, his army, and thousands of loyalists who had chosen the crown over their homes. Captain Hale was likely on one of them. Eleanor imagined him standing at the stern, watching the city shrink, drinking from his silver flask, still believing in an order that had crumbled beneath his feet. "The tide took them," Eleanor said. "And the cannons," Julian added, patting the barrel of the massive gun next to them. One of the guns Henry Knox had dragged all the way from Ticonderoga to force this very moment. "Can we go down?" Eleanor asked. "Is it safe?" "Washington's men are securing the gates," Julian said. "But for us, yes, it is time to go home." King Street, the city they entered, was not the city they had fled. Boston was a skeleton. The streets were littered with debris, broken furniture, shattered glass, and the strange, sad refuse of an army that had left in a panic. The British had spiked their cannons and thrown them into the harbor. They had looted shops. They had cut down the Liberty Tree for firewood. The air smelled of stale smoke and neglect. Eleanor walked down King Street. It felt like walking through a graveyard. The townhouse still stood, but the lion and unicorn statues were gone, torn down, she heard, by eager patriots hours ago. She stopped in front of Sterling and Cumberland Horology. The windows were boarded up with rough planks. The sign, the beautiful hand-painted clock face her father had commissioned, was swinging by a single hinge, creaking in the wind. Scree, scree. "Do you want me to come in with you?" Julian asked gently. Eleanor looked at the door. It was scarred with musket ball holes. "No," she said. "I need to do this part alone." Julian nodded. He kissed her forehead. "I will be at the Green Dragon. Revere is tapping a keg to celebrate. Join us when you are ready." Eleanor watched him limp away down the street, disappearing into the fog that was just beginning to roll in from the bay. She turned to the door. She reached into her pocket. She didn't have the key. It had been lost in the tunnel that night. She pushed the door. It wasn't locked. The lock had been shot out by Captain Hale a lifetime ago. She stepped inside. The shop was freezing. It was colder inside than out. It was a ruin. The British had been thorough. The display cases were smashed kindling. The workbench was overturned. The shelves were bare, stripped of every ounce of brass and steel that could be melted down for musket balls. The floor was covered in a layer of grime, broken glass, and feathers from a torn mattress. But there, in the center of the devastation, standing like a stubborn sentinel, was the grandfather clock. It was battered. The mahogany case was scratched, and the glass of the hood was cracked. But it was still standing. Eleanor walked toward it. Her footsteps echoed on the floorboards where her father had died. She could almost see the stain on the wood, though the dust had covered it long ago. She reached out and touched the clock. The wood was cold. "I am back, Papa," she whispered. She opened the waste door. It swung on its damaged hinges, empty. Just as she had left it, she closed her eyes. She remembered the list. She remembered the fear. She remembered the warmth of the hearth in the kitchen. She walked into the back. The kitchen was stripped bare. The copper pots were gone. The table was gone. The only thing remaining was the heavy iron stove, too heavy to steal. And on the mantel, forgotten in the chaos, was a single tallow candle in a tin holder. It was half-burnt, covered in a year's worth of dust. Eleanor picked it up. She took her tinderbox from her coat pocket, a soldier's habit she had acquired. Strike, spark, blow. She lit the candle. The flame was small, blue at the base, yellow at the tip. It flickered in the drafty room, casting long dancing shadows against the bare walls. Eleanor carried the candle back into the shop. She set it down on the overturned workbench. The light illuminated the wreckage, but it also illuminated something else. In the corner, under a pile of rags, something glinted. Eleanor walked over and kicked the rags aside. It was a vise. Her father's bench vise, heavy iron, bolted to a fragment of the table leg that had been snapped off. She crouched down and touched the cold metal. They hadn't taken it. It was too heavy, too mundane. She smiled. She looked around the room. The shop was dead. The inventory was gone. The customer list was burned. But the tools remained. She looked at the grandfather clock. She walked over to it and opened the hood. She examined the movement. The pendulum suspension spring was broken. The weights were missing, stolen for lead. But the gears, the brass wheels she had filed and polished since she was a child, they were still there. Tarnished, dusty, but whole. Eleanor reached into her pocket. She pulled out the single small gear she had carried with her through the siege. The gear she had held in the prison cell. The gear she had looked at on the hill at sunrise. She placed the gear on the ledge of the clock face. "Repair," she said aloud. It was not a question. It was a declaration. She would not make this shop what it was. That shop belonged to Arthur Sterling, a subject of the king. She would make something new. She looked at the candle burning on the bench. The wax was dripping down the side, forming a pool on the scarred wood. This was the last candle of the old life. The last light of the colony. Eleanor sat on a crate in front of the candle. She watched it burn. She watched the flame consume the tallow, transforming matter into light and heat. She thought of the war. It wasn't over. The British had left Boston, but they were sailing for New York. The fighting would continue. Julian would have to leave soon, but Boston was free. She thought of the 13 strikes in the tower, the defiance, the chaos. "We broke the time," she whispered. "Now we have to reset it." The candle flared one last time. The wick curled, glowing red. The flame stretched tall, fighting the encroaching darkness. And then it went out. A thin trail of gray smoke rose into the cold air. Eleanor sat in the dark. But she wasn't afraid. She knew the layout of this room by heart. She knew where the windows were. She knew where the door was. And she knew that outside, the sun was setting, but the stars were coming out. "Goodbye, Papa," she said to the darkness. She stood up. She didn't look back. She walked to the door, stepping over the debris. She stepped out onto King Street. The gas lamps were not lit, but the moon was full. She turned toward the Green Dragon Tavern. She could hear distant laughter and the sound of a fiddle. Eleanor Sterling began to walk. She walked with a purpose. She walked not as a daughter, not as a spy, but as a citizen. The last candle had burned out. But the dawn was coming. Epilogue, 1790. The shop on State Street, formerly King Street, was known simply as Sterling's. It was not the largest shop in Boston, but it was the most respected. It was known for two things: the precision of its marine chronometers, which guided the new American merchant fleet to China and back, and the fact that it was run by a woman. Eleanor Sterling stood behind the counter. She wore a dress of practical blue linen and spectacles perched on her nose. The shop was warm. A new stove roared in the corner. The walls were lined with clocks. New clocks, built with American steel and American brass. They ticked in a robust, synchronized chorus. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The door opened. The bell, a new, clear silver bell, chimed. A man walked in. He walked with a cane, but his step was strong. He wore a civilian coat, but he carried himself like a soldier. There was gray in his hair now. "Mrs. Thorne," Julian said, smiling. "The shipment has arrived from Philadelphia. The steel springs." "Good," Eleanor said, looking up from her ledger. "The Navy Department is impatient." A small boy, perhaps 7 years old, ran out from the back room. He held a wooden toy boat in one hand and a brass gear in the other. "Mama! Papa! Look! I made the wheel fit!" Eleanor came around the counter. She knelt down and looked at the toy. The boy had wedged the gear onto the mast of the boat. "It's a steering wheel," the boy declared proudly, "to guide the ship." Eleanor looked at Julian. He was watching them with a look of profound contentment. "A steering wheel," Eleanor agreed, smoothing her son's hair. "That is very important, Arthur. Without a wheel, the ship drifts." "Like we did?" the boy asked, repeating a story he had heard 100 times. "Like we did," Julian said, resting his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Until we found the current." Eleanor stood up. She looked around her shop. In the hallway, the old grandfather clock stood. It had been restored. The mahogany shone with beeswax. The glass was new, and inside the pendulum swung with a perfect, mesmerizing rhythm. It kept the time of a new nation. Eleanor walked over to the window. She looked out at the busy street. Boston was booming. Ships crowded the harbor. The scars of the war were gone, covered by new paint and new bricks. But she remembered. She remembered the fog. She remembered the tunnel. She remembered the candle burning in the ruin. She turned back to her family. "Lock the door, Julian," she said. "It's time to go home." Julian flipped the sign in the window to closed. But as they walked out into the twilight, Eleanor knew that for them, the shop was never truly closed. The gears they had set in motion were turning still, winding the future, second by precious second.